Greece was finally at peace. After the destruction of Thebes, no city dared challenge Alexander. The old rivalries had disappeared. For the first time in centuries, most of the Greek world marched under a single commander. But Alexander never dreamed of ruling only Macedonia, nor was his ambition limited to Greece. Since childhood, he had listened to his father speak of a far greater enemy, an empire so vast it seemed to have no end. Beyond the Aegean Sea lay Persia, the greatest empire the world had ever known. Its territory stretched from the shores of Asia Minor to the deserts of Egypt, from the mountains of Armenia to the borders of India. Millions of people lived under the rule of the great king. Hundreds of nations, dozens of languages, unimaginable wealth, palaces covered in gold, armies recruited from every corner of the empire. For nearly 2 centuries, no power had seriously threatened Persian supremacy. Many kings dreamed of defeating Persia. None had succeeded. Now, that challenge belonged to a young man, only 22 years old. To many, it was an impossible mission. To Alexander, it was destiny. In the spring of 334 BC, he finally gave the order. The invasion of Asia had begun. Before crossing the sea, Alexander gathered his commanders. Every man knew exactly where he belonged. Nothing would be left to chance. The Macedonian army was not the largest of its time, but it may have been the most disciplined the world had ever seen. Nearly 40,000 men answered the call. Most had served under Philip II for years, and now they would fight for his son. At the center of the army marched the legendary Macedonian phalanx, men trained to fight as a single body. Every soldier carried a sarissa, a pike nearly 6 meters long. When thousands of those weapons were leveled forward, they looked like a forest of steel. Behind the phalanx marched archers, spearmen, engineers, physicians, blacksmiths, supply wagons loaded with food, pack animals. It was an entire city on the move. But Alexander's greatest weapon stood on the flanks, the companion cavalry, the absolute elite of Macedonia. Noble horsemen trained from childhood, warriors capable of deciding a battle in a matter of minutes. Alexander always fought beside them, never behind them, never far away. The king deliberately chose the most dangerous position on the battlefield. That was how he earned the trust of his soldiers. They did not march only for their commander. They marched beside him. Within that army, every man believed he was part of something far greater than a military campaign. They were about to step into history. The preparations were complete. The ships waited in the harbors of Macedonia. The wind blew steadily toward the east, as if calling the army across the sea. Before departing, Alexander insisted on visiting his father's tomb. There, he remained in silence for several moments. No soldier approached. No officer interrupted him. For years, Philip II had dreamed of carrying the war into Persia. He rebuilt the Macedonian army, reformed the kingdom, unified Greece. But he died before the campaign could begin. Now, it fell to his son to finish what he had started. Alexander slowly rose to his feet. He cast one last look at his father's resting place, then departed, without saying a single word. Soon afterward, he reached the harbor. Hundreds of ships rocked gently upon the water. Thousands of soldiers boarded in complete silence. Horses were carefully guided onto the transports. Weapons, shields, sarissas, supplies, everything had to cross the sea. Alexander walked to the bow of his flagship.
Ahead of him lay the Hellespont, the natural boundary between two continents. Behind him, Europe. Ahead, Asia. Once he crossed those waters, his life would never be the same. And with it, the destiny of the world would change forever. At last, dawn had arrived. The sea was calm. Hundreds of Macedonian ships waited for the signal to depart. The soldiers stood in silence, staring toward the horizon. Many had never left Europe. On that day, every one of them would cross into an unknown continent. Alexander boarded last. Before stepping aboard, he turned for one final look. The mountains of Greece slowly faded beneath the morning light. Perhaps it would be the last time he ever set foot on his homeland. The wind filled the sails. One by one, the ships left the harbor. The great fleet advanced slowly through the Hellespont. For centuries, this narrow stretch of water had divided two worlds, Europe and Asia. Alexander remained at the bow throughout the entire crossing. His eyes never left the horizon. He was not looking at a new land. He was looking at the beginning of a campaign that would change human history forever. As the fleet approached the Asian shore, the young king ordered his ship to slow. He took a long Macedonian spear, waited for the perfect moment, and hurled it with all his strength toward the beach. The spear buried itself deep in the sand. Alexander smiled quietly, then declared before his officers, "I receive Asia as a land won by the spear." Even before the first battle, he already believed victory was inevitable. At that very moment, the invasion of Persia had truly begun. But Alexander did not march against the Persians immediately. First, there was one place he needed to visit. Only a few kilometers away lay the ancient ruins of Troy, the setting of the most famous war in Greek mythology. Since childhood, Alexander had heard those stories from Aristotle himself. His greatest hero had never been Heracles, nor Perseus. It was Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Iliad. As he reached the ancient walls, Alexander dismounted from Bucephalus. He walked slowly among the weathered stones. Silence filled the ruins. Here, according to tradition, thousands of heroes had fought centuries before. Alexander approached the tomb believed to belong to Achilles. He placed a wreath upon the grave. For several long moments, he stood completely still. Not a single soldier dared interrupt him. His closest friend, Hephaestion, paid tribute as well, but at the tomb of Patroclus. Just as Achilles and Patroclus had fought side by side, the two friends believed they shared the same destiny. Before departing, Alexander received ancient weapons preserved inside the Temple of Athena. According to tradition, they had belonged to the heroes of the Trojan War. Whether they were genuine or not made little difference. To Alexander, they represented something far greater. From that day forward, he no longer marched only as King of Macedonia. He marched as the heir to the heroes of Greece, and he believed that one day his own name would be remembered beside theirs. While Alexander landed in Asia, the news spread rapidly across the Persian Empire. The governors of the western provinces, the powerful satraps, began gathering their armies. The invasion had finally begun. Even so, many Persian nobles showed little concern. After all, Persia had defeated countless invaders over the centuries. They believed Alexander would be nothing more than another failed conqueror. But one man saw the situation differently. His name was Memnon of Rhodes. Ironically, he was not Persian at all. He was Greek, a seasoned mercenary commander, hired to lead part of the great king's army. Memnon knew the Macedonians better than anyone.
He had watched Philip transform their army, and he understood that Alexander was even bolder than his father. During the Council of War, he proposed a different strategy. Do not fight Alexander immediately.
Destroy the crops, burn the supply depots, evacuate the cities. Force the Macedonians to advance without provisions. The deeper they marched into Asia, the weaker they would become. It was a brilliant strategy, perhaps the only one capable of stopping the invasion. But the satraps were outraged. How could they abandon their own lands without a fight? How could they destroy the wealth they had sworn to protect? Pride prevailed. Memnon's plan was rejected. Instead, the Persians chose to face Alexander immediately. Without realizing it, they had just made one of the greatest mistakes of the entire campaign. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Asia Minor, the Macedonian army continued its advance. And before long, the two worlds would finally collide.
After several days of marching through Asia Minor, Macedonian scouts finally found the enemy. Ahead of them flowed the Granicus River. Its waters looked calm, but beneath the surface, a deadly trap awaited. Its banks were steep, the ground was slippery, and on the opposite shore, thousands of Persian soldiers stood ready for battle. The Persian cavalry occupied the entire elevated riverbank. Behind them stood thousands of Greek mercenaries, battle-hardened veterans, men who understood Macedonian warfare as well as the Macedonians themselves. For the first time, the two greatest armies in the world stood face to face. Alexander carefully studied every detail of the battlefield. Nothing escaped his attention. Beside him, Parmenion, the most experienced of his generals, finally broke the silence. According to him, the wisest course was to wait. Nightfall was only a few hours away. By morning, the men would be rested. Perhaps the Persians would abandon their positions. To attack immediately would be an enormous risk. The river would break the phalanx's formation. The cavalry would have to climb a steep bank under enemy attack. Everything favored the Persians. But Alexander saw something else. If he showed fear in his very first battle, all of Asia would hear of it. He had not crossed the Hellespont to hesitate. Turning toward his officers, he answered with unwavering confidence. It would be a disgrace to fear a mere river after crossing the Hellespont. At that moment, the decision was made. The battle would begin immediately. War trumpets echoed across the valley. The entire Macedonian line began to move. Alexander did not remain behind the lines. As always, he chose the most dangerous position. He mounted Bucephalus, lowered his spear, and personally led the companion cavalry. The horses charged toward the river. The water rose nearly to their chests. Hidden rocks made every step more dangerous. The current pushed both men and horses downstream. On the opposite bank, the Persians stood perfectly still. Then came the first arrows. Moments later, the spears. Persian archers unleashed a deadly storm. The cavalry charged down from the elevated bank. Every yard gained came at a terrible cost. Horses slipped on the rocks. Soldiers were swept away by the current. Others vanished beneath the water. And still, no one retreated. Alexander continued forward. His crimson cloak stood out amid the chaos. Impossible to miss. The Persian commanders noticed it immediately. If Alexander died, the war would end right there. The order was given. The entire Persian cavalry concentrated its attack on the young king. Within moments, Alexander found himself completely surrounded. The finest Persian nobles charged directly at him. Spithridates, Rosicles, Mithridates, all sought the same reward, the death of the King of Macedon. The clash between the two cavalries was savage. Spears shattered, shields flew through the air. Men fell on both sides. Alexander drove his spear straight through Mithridates. The Persian commander fell dead instantly. But almost at the same moment, Rosaces charged from Alexander's right. With a tremendous blow, he struck Alexander's helmet. The bronze split open. The blade nearly pierced through the protection. For a brief instant, the young king was completely vulnerable. That was the moment Mithridates had been waiting for. He raised his enormous battle axe, preparing the blow that would change history. Alexander had no time to react. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. Just as the axe began to fall, another horseman burst into the fight at full speed. It was Clitus the Black, Alexander's old companion. Without a moment's hesitation, Clitus delivered a devastating strike. Mithridates' arm was severed before the axe could reach Alexander. The Persian commander collapsed, dead. The King of Macedon had escaped death by only a heartbeat. Years later, Alexander himself would admit that he owed his life to Clitus's courage. Meanwhile, the battle raged on. But the decisive moment had already passed. The Persians had lost their greatest opportunity, and Alexander was still alive. The deaths of the Persian commanders changed the course of the battle completely. Without leadership, the Persian cavalry began to fall back. Alexander recognized the decisive moment. He raised his sword and ordered the entire Macedonian line forward. At last, the phalanx reached the opposite bank of the river. Thousands of sarissas advanced like a living wall. No cavalry charge could break that formation. At the same time, the companion cavalry swept around the Persian flanks. The Persians began to lose ground. Little by little, their battle line collapsed. Some tried desperately to rally the troops. Others simply fled. But one force still stood firm: the Greek mercenaries, veterans in Persian service, men who understood Macedonian tactics better than almost anyone. They fought to the very last. The battle became even more brutal. For hours, neither side gave a single step. But in the end, the discipline of the Macedonian phalanx prevailed. The mercenaries were surrounded. There was no escape. Most died where they stood. The survivors were taken prisoner. Alexander then made a surprising decision. He did not execute them. Instead, he ordered them to be sent back to Macedonia in chains. According to Alexander, they had betrayed all of Greece by fighting for Persia. As the sun began to set, silence finally settled over the battlefield. The Granicus River had witnessed Alexander's first great victory on Asian soil. The campaign had only just begun, but the world would never be the same again. News of the Persian defeat spread with astonishing speed. City after city, its gates swung open. Many never even attempted to resist. They understood that opposing Alexander was hopeless. Yet the young king presented himself as something more than a conqueror. Whenever he entered a Greek city in Asia Minor, he delivered the same message. He did not come as an invader. He came as a liberator. He promised to free the Greek cities from Persian rule. He reduced taxes, restored local governments, respected ancient traditions. It was a brilliant strategy. Alexander gained allies without fighting another battle. Thousands of people no longer saw him as an enemy, but as the leader who would finally end Persian domination in the region. Meanwhile, the wealth captured from the liberated cities supplied his army. New recruits joined his ranks. Food stores continued to grow. Confidence spread throughout the camp. Every victory made Alexander stronger. And with every city that fell, the heart of the Persian Empire came one step closer. Far from the battlefields of Asia Minor, within the magnificent royal palaces of Susa, The news finally reached the great king. Darius III listened carefully to every report. A small European army had defeated his governors, captured important cities, and continued advancing deeper into his empire. For several moments, the emperor remained silent. This was more than a military defeat. It was a direct challenge to his authority. For the first time, Darius understood that Alexander was not just another invader. He was an enemy capable of destroying everything the Persian Empire had built over nearly 2 centuries.
Then, the great king made his decision. No more satraps, no more local commanders. The next time, he would lead the Persian army himself. Messengers rode across every province of the empire. Thousands of soldiers answered the call. Median cavalry, Persian archers, Babylonian infantry, warriors from Armenia, men from the mountains of Persia, from the deserts of Syria, from the plains of Mesopotamia. The greatest army on earth was beginning to assemble. Meanwhile, unaware of the immense force gathering against him, Alexander continued marching south.
Every step brought him closer to the most powerful man in the world. Very soon, 2 kings, 2 empires, and 2 destinies would stand face to face. The victory at the Granicus River proved that Alexander could defeat the Persians, but defeating satraps was very different from facing the great king himself. In the next episode, Alexander will conquer the entire western coast of Asia Minor. He will face the legendary siege of Miletus, capture Halicarnassus, and force Darius III to personally lead the greatest army ever assembled by the Persian Empire. The battle that will decide the fate of 2 worlds is about to begin.